It's time for our Wednesday evening Bible class to begin. If you have your Bibles, please turn to John the 8th chapter. I want us to notice a passage of what the Jews said. Has this ever interested you to say, how could they make this statement? In John 8 and verse 33, when Jesus is speaking about the truth shall make you free, they answered unto them, we are Abraham's seed, and have never been in bondage to any man. How sayest thou, ye shall be made free? Can you imagine how maybe a Jew, grounded in the law of God, understanding God's intent, as we see here in Leviticus 23 and through 25, especially as we looked at chapter 25, where they might say they've never been in bondage to any man, because the Jews would not be in bondage. They would not be sold as bondservants. We saw this last week in Leviticus 25 and verse 42. They are my servants, God says, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as bondmen. That's his people. And I always thought, well, you went into Babylonian captivity, did you? You went to Assyrian captivity, didn't you? How can you say that? Because they were looking at the bondage, maybe. I'm not saying that as a fact, but I wonder why, people making a statement with Jesus. Jesus doesn't fire back. He tells you what he means in bondage to what? It's sin. But they were fighting back and said, well, that is a crazy thing. You went into Babylonian what? Captivity. You're slaves. And he delivered them from captivity, where they were put to task work. And as we saw in chapter 25 of Leviticus, they were not the idea of bondman, not that you could not sell yourself as a Hebrew, a hired servant, but with regard, the idea that you have no choice in the matter of becoming a servant. You are taken captive in the sense and put to task work as God's people, that we're Abraham's seed. That's not something we've ever, from God's standpoint, we've been free from bondage to any man. And while technically, they would be put to work, we see Babylonian captivity. The people who are royal, they would be involved in being involved in overseeing things. This idea of the task work and the rigor. The fact that they had no say-so in the matter, you could be a hired servant, but this bondservant is being emphasized as one against your will. And that is something that God says his people would not be. And excuse me, David. No, I understand that, but God delivered them that they would never be in bondage again to any man. That's what this passage is saying in Leviticus, that differentiated them from a hired servant. You're not going to be in bondage to any people. They could not become a slave like that. I know, but I could say a Jewish leader knowing the law could have that in his mind. I didn't say it was great. Jesus is talking about bondage to sin anyway. And I just don't think they're overlooking the fact that they went into captivity. It's this type of rigor work and the idea of a slave against your will. Now, we also see that people who are sojourners, they would become slaves of God's people, and they could be part of their family, handed down from families to family. And we see that there's 539 tasks, people that were put to slavery by Solomon and David. David had some bodyguards. You would call they were paid soldiers, but they were from the Kerethites and the Pelethites, who were foreign people that were put to task in protecting David. But they were put into task work of the Masons were going to be involved in helping build the temple. And they were people, but they were people that had been conquered, and they did not completely cast out all of those inhabitants of Canaan. And so Solomon put them to task work. That's the that's the slavery, that's involuntary slavery, God's people would put them under. But the Israelites, according to God here, you could hire yourself as a servant and a hired servant, and we're in the context of Jubilee. That'd be the 49th year, and as you go into the 50th. But also, from a Hebrew standpoint, every 7 years you were released. That was the blessing on a Hebrew who hired himself out as a servant, but he was never to be taken against his will, and in the sense of being a slave to people. That was against God's will. And I can just see those days in days of Jesus, they were not overlooking they'd been in bondage, but they had some reason for making that a statement, and it's been God's will. What do you mean we're in bondage? He never was going to put us in bondage. It was impossible that a Hebrew slave could become a bondservant. Hired servant, yes, but not a bondservant. Jesus is talking about you were in bondage, and they're looking at it from maybe that standpoint. I offer that suggestion, and why we study Leviticus. It brings thoughts to your mind, so that may be why they're doing what they're doing. It's not necessarily defending them, it's just understanding them, that they're not that crazy. They're not that off base. They're not that stupid to be saying what they believed as God's people. There may be a basis for that, and I'm just offering that as a suggestion. Now, question 21 is what we need to finish for this evening. How were the release of land and hired servants carried out equitably? That indeed it was fair, because the 50th year, all the land would go back to the one who originally possessed it. And we see a differentiation between how you treated houses and land, and then how you dealt with the Levitical priesthood that did not have any possessions of land, and they would be in houses. And we talked about the land thing. I'm not going to rehash that, but let's talk about the servant for a moment. How is that going to be set forth equitably? Here is a hired servant. Let's forget about the every 7 years. Let's say that here is one that was hired himself out in the 4th year. You got 3 more years to Jubilee. You know you're going to be released. And therefore, in the 5th year, in the 4th year, and then in the 5th year, you got where I can redeem myself. I don't have to be under hired out, so I'm going to redeem myself, or my uncle is, or my cousin is, as we see the text talking about. How could that be done equitably? What does the Bible say here? That say, oh, that makes sense. That's being fair. Okay. Verse 50, 51, start with verse 49. If he wax rich, he may redeem himself. And that didn't mean he won the lottery. That doesn't mean they were playing that at the time. But he waxed rich, so he redeems himself. And he shall reckon with him that bought him. So I'm going to deal with the fellow who bought me as a hired servant, gave me money, and maybe I was able to pay off some debts and pay off this and that. That's why I hired myself out. And he says, with him that bought him, from the year that he sold himself to him unto the year of what? Jubilee. So we're not talking about, well, the first year, now it's going to be 50 more years. Let's say, because that is a problem among the scholars. How come you sell yourself out to a sojourner, a non-Jew, and he didn't have to give you up till the day of Jubilee in this text? But a Jew who hired himself out to another Jew, he's going to release him in 7 years. Does that, because you don't have God speaking about that problem. It's generated by saying, it's unquestionably that the law would be easier for the non-Jew than is the Jew. So they're feeling, well, these people would have to be under that 7-year rule too, even though God doesn't specify it here in this context. I understand that. That probably is true. But let's say we're looking, take that out of the question, or the point, that we're saying we're in the, we sold ourselves maybe 3 years before Jubilee, or 5 years before Jubilee. In the 4th year, hey, uncle gave me some money, and I can now redeem myself. Or maybe he was going to redeem me for me. How would you determine what the guy deserves back? And what you would do, they would notice it's two standards. It's two, not standards, but two ingredients to this calculation, how you would do that. So he'll be under the year Jubilee, and the price of his sale shall be according to the number of years. And it said, according to the time of a hired servant shall he be with him. Hired servant shall he be with him. So here's, you multiply, let's say what you have earned, that you paid off. And you can determine, they had a wage for a day servant or a servant, and you could just multiply that to the 360 days in a year, according to their calendar, and multiply that by the years that are left, and you could find out what you're worth to him now. That's equitable. It also include it'd be based upon what you have already paid off. And so that would be what is left, the years by the amount paid to the day's hired servant, of the time of a hired servant, of where he received wages. In accordance, you would determine that. And I think was an equitable way of accomplishing those things. And therefore, there he may be yet many years, according to him, he shall give back the price of his redemption out of the money that he was bought for. Maybe many years before. Of course, this is dealing with the time of Jubilee that he's talking about. And if there remain but few years unto the year Jubilee, then he shall reckon with him according to the years shall he give back the price of his redemption. So it could be a lot, and it could be, as you get closer to the end, it'd be less. But there would be a standard by which to follow. I've always thought about that. Well, I don't know what the standard would be. And he said, yeah, it's right here in the text. Read it. Think about it. I try to understand it, that according to the time, or some of the translations have the idea of wages and what is paid during that year that he's already worked. Well, that's going to be assumed that's how he's going to do it in the future. So what is he worth to me? The money that he wants to pay me, this is what I would get out of him. That's what I get back. And that's what I think they did. And of course, we come to the end of the chapter in chapter 25. If he be not redeemed by these means, then he shall go out the year of Jubilee with his children with him, paying nobody anything. And he says, for unto me the children of Israel are servants. They are my servants, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. I am Jehovah your God. That's why you're not going to be bondservants to any man. You could be a hired servant, but you're not going to be a bondservant. I taught you out of Egypt. I brought you out of that type of slavery. And now you become my people that are not going to be doing that. And therefore we see, well, how could I redeem it? And have you ever thought about what is bankruptcy today in our time? Do you get to start over? That's the concept of that I'm not going to be able to pay all those bills, so we'll declare bankruptcy. I'm not saying that's what a child of God should do. I'm talking about it's a reality of how we reset the time again, reset everything. And God had his way of doing that. Now, if you bought, we said this earlier, if you bought a house in the walled cities, you had a year to redeem it. If not, it belonged to who bought it forever, perpetuity. That means it's not going to be redeemed at Jubilee. It was in a walled city. But if a house was out in the fields, that would not be the case. What's the reason for that difference? Because a lot of times in the walled city, it was divided by the tribes that were involved, and anybody could build a house on any field. And so that would be a differentiation out there, that would be redeemed, but in the walled city it would not. But if you bought in the Levitical cities, if you bought a house of a Levite, it's going back to him in the day Jubilee. And he could redeem a house anytime he wanted to, not just the first year. He could buy it back at that time, because they'd already set aside cities and houses that the Levites could live in. They had provided for their well-being along those lines, so they were always going to have that. And you were just purchasing knowing that it's already a done deal, that it'll go back to him free. that as you get to live in that house, but Jubilee would go back to them. So Jubilee is sounding the trumpets. It's not, I'm jubilant, but there was a lot of happiness in there because things kind of reset. The slaves were being, Hebrews hired slaves, hired men, they or ladies. They would be involved in every 7 years. They would be free, but it happened on the 50th year, following the 7th year leading to Jubilee. That would always happen as well. So it was a time where they could realize that here is God's ways of doing things, and this was his way of resetting things for his people as they live in that land. Any questions on lesson number 11? All right, lesson 12. What's great about lesson 12? I know it's the last one. That's my joke for the day. It's the last one, but it's comprised of two chapters, and we're not going to slow down. I mean, we're not going to speed up just because we can smell the finish line. I hope you gain some knowledge on this. First thing, notice the difference between chapter 26 and 27. Notice at the end of chapter 26, you find this statement. These are the statutes and ordinances and laws which Jehovah made between him and the children of Israel in Mount Sinai by Moses. At the end of chapter 27 in verse 34, these are the commandments which Jehovah commanded Moses for the children of Israel to Mount Sinai. Why didn't he just wait to say that after he finished 26 and 27 like we have it in a group? That's why you look at these little details. A lot of them might be insignificant with you, and this will be your last painful effort in this class. I got to deal with specifics because this was an appendix. This was important to Jews. He had finished in chapter 26. He had brought forth the things that would be involved with them in general, but there were some things that they needed to cover, and that was indeed added to this as we would think of as an appendix to the end of a book or a book of laws. Very detailed things, and we'll talk about them, and that's how we will finish the book of Leviticus, because that's the way God finishes it. So we got some interesting questions here. I think some of them will be pretty straightforward. And question number 1, it may make you think in the idea of looking at idolatry in a way that's good. Is God pleased with only who we worship, but not how we worship? People say it's the important thing is to worship God. Don't get all involved in the details of how we worship. Now, in chapter 26, the very first verse, how do you know that even from the standpoint of God's law to his Jewish people, that's not a true statement? God cares not only who you worship, but how you worship. How is that philosophy that so many people have contrary to this first verse? Or maybe it's not. Defend it. What does he say? You shall make you no idols, neither shall you rear you up a graven image or a pillar. I'm reading from the American Standard. Neither shall you place any figured stone in your land. To do what? How am I worshiping? How am I worshiping? I'm bowing down, giving them honor. What, you shall have no graven images. I am a jealous God. Okay, but it's the most important thing. How you go about that is different. You're not supposed to have them, but if you bow down to something, that would be different. That doesn't even fit real well with a logical standard, because that went with that. And the worship was kissing toward an object. And how we worship, this was how they would bow down before the image. Now, notice how he describes, and the reason I'm saying is because what is John 4, when Jesus speaks about worship, how does he debunk that philosophy. Just worship God. It makes no difference how you worship. How did Jesus say that? That would teach us that's a contrary concept. Chapter 4, in verse 24, God is a spirit, and they that worship him, now we're getting into how. He's just definitely dealing with the how. God is a spirit, and they that worship him, he's my object, must worship him how? I mean, am I wrong? Just must worship him what? Well, that doesn't work. Must worship him how? Tell me how. In spirit and in truth. That's how. That's what fits. In spirit. Why? Because God is a spirit. That I am going to be engaged with my spirit because God is a spirit. And I will be worship him according to truth. I'll serve the only true God. So idolatry is not going to be in my world. Even covetousness, I'm going to keep out of my life because I'm not going to worship money. I'm not going to worship men. I'm not going to worship anything that takes me away from God. How I worship is very important to God. It's according to truth. How did he tell us to worship him in song? He told us how, didn't he? Speak to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Singing with grace in your hearts unto God. How you worship is very important. And so a lot of people today, it doesn't make any difference, instrumental music or not. It's the fact that you worship. It comes from your heart. And it doesn't make any difference how you worship. Well, is it according to the revealed truth that he says forth? That becomes the standard of how. So that's a great passage to keep in mind. But he's bringing both of these together because you're automatically, when you make an idol, what are you going to do with it? You will worship that. He talks about stone here. Could you worship a wooden image that's not stone? Because you've got a lot of carving going on. You got a graven image. You got a pillar. Now, what's this pillar? Pillar. Some of your versions have what word? Do you have pillar? What's that? All right, now standing. So we're not talking about graven, we're talking about standing. So what would be a standing image? Think about a four-sided image that at the top, it will come narrow at the top and become a pyramid at the top. Obsolete, we call it. The Egyptians is another word, I can't say the Hebrew correctly, but it was the homage unto the sun god. But it would be a tall structure, standing structure, and it would kind of come as a pyramid at the top, and the Egyptians would worship it. Well, here were Jews, and they were being warned, don't you do stuff like that, because that's setting forth an image connected with idolatry of their day. And so a lot of times that was with stone, but a graven image in Isaiah speaks about the fact that you could throw it in the fire, and it is a graven image, and you throw it in the fire and it'll burn up. That's probably wood. In fact, the context says it's a fir tree. So I know that even if you made something out of wood, if we make anything out of our heart that we devote, that's idolatry with God as well. But there indeed was that standing pillar or figured stone that you bow down, that you've carved as stone, that becomes your God. So those were the details that would be affecting those people that had been in Egypt and learned their ways to stay away from. And how they were worshiping, they would bow down to those things. I don't need to construct them, and I don't need to kiss toward them and worship unto God. And so it matters how we worship God, and he's told us how. Question 2. Specifically, how would God's people prosper in the land if they obeyed God? So let's kind of get into verse 3. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, then boom, 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 boom. You're going to have all sorts of blessings. Did you characterize them? Did you put them in a category? Did you write them down on your outline that you could number them? Did we do that? Well, let's do it mentally together if you didn't. And if you did, check it off. See if it works with the text. I will give you rains in their season. Do we need some rain now? I think it's seasonal time to do it. God would be taking care of that probably. He will, maybe next week. It'll be in His time. But we need rain, don't we? There comes a time when we get too much of it, we get not enough. But I'll give you rains in their season, when it's a proper time to cause the growth. And the land shall yield its what? That's point number 2. The land shall yield its increase. Point number 3 just as important as point number 1 and 2. And also your trees of the field shall yield their fruit. I got 3 things. I got 3 things that of blessings. Your threshing shall reach unto the vintage, and the vintage shall reach unto the sowing time. Now you lost me. I got fruitful trees, got fruitful lands, I got rain. That's about as much farming as I got in my mind. But these little fancy words here of threshing, vintage. What are we talking about? David? Okay. Passover would be the first fruits. A lot of times that would be the wheat. And you begin to then harvest your Pentecost 50 days later. Be set for April and May and June. Then when you talk about vintage, you're talking about your grapes. They'll kick in July, middle of July, and so forth. And then you're threshing, bringing in the harvest of your wheat and your barley, and then to the vintage. All those months, 6 months there, then indeed that they would follow in place. You're not going to lose. You're going to be getting the fruit of the grape. That's going to have its season, and I'm going to be sending the rain in its season for all of that. And then there'll be time of gathering that up until planting. We talked about, and this just reinforces it, we don't start time in Leviticus when it speaks about the planting and sowing in the first of April, as being because April is the first month. We're into the 7th month that we talked about, because that's when the harvesting, they'll be bringing in those things. It's a day, a joyous occasion of serving God and so forth. So this would fit with the understanding the calendar in the terms of planting, because at the fall, when they gather in all their things, they would then start preparing the ground to plant, and then we'd start the year over again. But as David said, it's all together. It's working. I will give you rain in seasons. It's going to be producing after its kind, and then your threshing, as you begin to thresh, you'll reach unto the vintage. You will be doing that work even now. Here comes the grapes, and we'll be taking care of that. And the vintage shall reach unto the what? Land prepared, sowing time. We've already seen that God would bless those. We talked about Pentecost and that sort of thing in these times, and we talked about the years leading up, where they'd have to leave the field alone, and they would have to have enough store for 3 years. We talked about that last time, and we saw why is that the case, because you'd be in August, September, October, when you would take that, you'd be planting again. And so you would start that 7th year on the 6th year. And then you would, for 2 years, you would not eat, and you would have the old store, because He had provided for you in the 6th year enough to last you to eat that which is harvested in the 9th year. And that's what we saw in the Bible. And that's how God would provide for them. And He's kind of given this idea too, that it's going to be for you. And we already have the idea of the old store that's taken place. And we'll talk about that, question number 3. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. Why was eating old store part of the blessings? Yeah. Look at verse 10. This is wonderful. And you shall eat old store. long kept. Now, if we hadn't studied the chapters before that, what do you mean? Long store. I don't like leftovers. And food gets old. And ye shall bring forth the old because of the new. That's the American Standard Version. What does your version say? What's the concept you get out of your version? I know what I get out of mine. See if we're in close. So someone read that that's different from mine. Ye shall eat the old store, long kept, and ye shall bring forth the old because of the new. What does your passage say at that end? Same thing? Okay. There you go. You make room for it, don't you? And that's exactly what is said for. So I'm glad Virgil brings that up, because you have to work with this a lot of times, but it's because of the new. I need to, move that along. Because what? God has blessed me to this point. I've got new now. My 9th year, I'm partaking of that, but this law, what I've had for these last 2 years, God has sustained me. That's what God promised to do if they would indeed follow the Lord. So old store, excuse me, go ahead.
We don't really have this concept because of the way we go to the grocery store, get our food. There's always food at the grocery store. But in agrarian societies, this time, and not even that long ago, and in some parts of the world today, you have your harvest, you're trying to get through the winter, to make it to that next planting and that first harvest next year, and are we going to have enough food to get that far? We're on short rations now because we're running low. You're going to eat the old store, or have to get rid of the old store to make room for the new, because you're not going to be on short rations. You're going to have nothing.
Yeah, that's right. But I would sure be happy that I have old store to eat, because my new one hadn't come in yet. But he said he'll come in and he'll last that long. That's just part of God's providence and taking care of his people. And he would use now the absence of that, even in this chapter we'll look at. He'll take that away from them when his people disobey God. And we'll see how drastic that becomes. So eating old store, that's not leftovers, and so that's a blessing if we understand the context. All right, question number 6, or number 4. Yeah. How is chapter 26, verse 11 and 12 fulfilled in the New Testament Christian? So let's read verses 11 and 12 and see if a passage doesn't come to your mind. I will set my tabernacle among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. And I will walk among you, and will be your God, and ye shall be my people. Where do we see this fulfilled in the New Testament Christian as a promise made to you and me, as he made it to the people that Paul wrote to? Is there a passage that stands out? There's one that stands out with me. Anybody have that? Yes, 2 Corinthians 6. I mean, that's the obvious one, and yet a lot of these quotes are from Isaiah and from 17 on. But look at chapter 6 and verse 16. What agreement hath the temple of God with idols? So how you worship me is important, but if you're going to serve me, then there'll be blessings. He says, hath the temple of God, what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? None. That's a rhetorical question. He says, for ye are a temple of the living God. Thank you. You Christians are a temple, or a tabernacle, or a tent, the people of the living God. Even as God said, I will dwell in them, and I will walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Who is true Israel today? Christians. Who is the temple? It's Christians. Christians make up, that's just the church. Now, it is also your body as a Christian. Why would I make that distinction? Because of 1 Corinthians 3 and 1 Corinthians 6. The Bible makes that distinction. I don't have any right to make a distinction when God doesn't. but there were people that were tearing down the church and bringing it down, or trying to do that. And it was holy. It's the temple of God, what you're doing. Chapter 6, don't you know that your body is a temple of what? The Holy Spirit, which is in you. You were bought with a price. And glorify God in your body. So the word temple, housing, we're indeed, we are God's people. He walks among us. He dwells in our hearts through faith. And therefore is that concept of a temple and God being with us and we being his people today. That's quite a blessing that we have as Christians. And they say, well, God's people, the Jews over there in Jerusalem today, those are the people of God. And there's a history of that, but we are New Israel. And we are, and Paul writes in Galatians and Romans indicating that's who we should be. All right? I know our time is getting short, but let's start on this one. What terror would be appointed for the disobedient people? So we're moving through 11 and beginning with verse 14. But if you will not hearken unto me, then here's going to be the things. Here, I'm Jehovah your God. I will bless you. Notice verse 13. Who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their bondman? That's my point. Again, why people might say that in John 8. And I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you upright. There's a bent over task work, forced labor, what they did in Egypt, no more. That they would indeed be free from that yoke. And they would not be, as we dwell in the land of Canaan, they'd be not sold as bondmen to any man. So we pick up verse 14. If they'll not hearken unto you, and will not do all these commandments, and if ye shall reject my statutes, and your soul abhor mine ordinances, so that ye will not do all my commandments, but break my covenant, I will also do this unto you. I will appoint terror over you. Notice how he describes breaking of covenant. And I don't abhor your ordinances. I just don't keep them, God. Yeah, you abhor them. He put all that in one category. Those are not different categories. Well, one's bad worse than the other one. They're all dealing with the fact that not doing his commandments, you break my covenant, and you really, what you do, you abhor mine because you want to do what you want to do. I would never abhor God's commandments. That's what you're doing when you're disobeying God. So I will appoint a terror. So what is the terror? In verse 16 in my Bible, it will be consumption and fever. Thou shalt consume the eyes and make the soul to pine away, and ye shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. In modern times, I said, well, what is consumption? Huh? Let me give you different views. The Septuagint, because it speaks here of the eyes and your spirit, they would call it jaundice, where it would affect your eyes and it would take away your spirit. They look at it as two different diseases we're talking about here. But one said there's just one disease, and it's consumption. That is the type will put you in a fever. Consumption and fever are brought together by most who interpret the passage. And it would be something feverish and shivering, and it would be that which would cause your problems with your eyes, all that, and your spirit to be taken away until you die. And that would indeed be a terror. So whatever that was, those are things that are involved in trying to understand that. It could be a lot of things we talk about, but it was combined with a fever, according to most, that consumption was, until it consumes you and you die. And I'll bring that on you, God says. I will do that because he is chastising his people for what they have done. Now let's prepare ourselves for the next few verses here, because he says you'll be chastised 7 times. So let's notice that if one doesn't get you, If one doesn't bring you into proper mindset, I will do something else. And 4 times he says, like in verse 18, if you will not yet for these things hearken to me, then I will chastise you 7 more times for your sins. Verse 21, if you walk contrary to me and will not hearken to me, I will bring 7 times more plagues. Verse 21. Verse 24, then also, if you walk contrary to you, and I will smite you even 7 times more for your sins. And I will bring a sword upon you. Vengeance of the covenant. Things are getting more intense. But what does it mean? I thought 7 times was a complete number. How come you have to do it 4 times, God? So let's be precise in our understanding that God's not contradicting himself in just a few verses. I need to have a concept where 7 is completeness, but it's in a context of 4 different occasions. And it looks like things are getting worse in what's coming upon them. Here are diseases that there'll be a terror. Remember when God promises people, I will not bring any of these diseases upon you that's brought upon the Egyptians. So he would bring that terror upon them. But all of a sudden, when that didn't happen, that didn't cause them to change, then there's the problem that they're having. So what does 7 times 7 and doing it 4 times mean? Other than something wasn't completed. And yet I'm using the word 7 times. Each time, as God brings judgment, is the fullness of that time set. There'll be another time set. If you do it, I'll bring even something more difficult for you. And it gets more difficult. And then they're eating their babies. That's how bad it gets. I'll bring that on you. As we'll see, and you look at your Bible, until your unchastised heart is humbled. Is humbled. You may do everything you can with an obstinate child on one occasion. You pulled out all the stops. And then you may intensify them for the next occasion. But you were still, I'll chastise you 7 times, the completeness for that moment, but I'll do it again, and I'll do it again, and I'll do it again. And then you'll see what you're in store, and that's exactly what happened to them. So that will prepare us for next time. Thank you very much.